Hi again, everybody. Tom Bragg, joined, as always, by Gazette Mail Assistant Sports Editor Derek Taylor, and a new addition to the WVHuddle.com Prep Football Podcast, Gazette Mail Prep Sports Reporter Ryan Pritt. Ryan, glad to have you on.
Glad to be here.
It was a weird week of high school football, to say the least, what with lightning delays and games getting called off that were played Monday. It's Wednesday as we record this. There were, the Wheeling Park Bridgeport saga kind of came to an end yesterday. We'll get into that. But what we'll do is we'll jump right in. We have the Gazette Mail football poll, been out for a couple days. We'll kind of go through that, starting in Class AAA. At the top, Capital, 2-0 now after the big win against South Charleston. Big in the sense of maybe momentum building. It wasn't a blowout win. 26-21. Derek, you and I were both at that game. It was just a lot different from the last two Capital South Charleston games, where Capital kind of ran away early and hid from South Charleston. This one was well played throughout, a couple turnovers, late touchdown made it a little closer than maybe the final score would have otherwise indicated. But I mean, if we'll see Cabell Midland when they come to town this week to play Capital, but I still think those are probably the top two teams in Class AAA, and that's reflected in the poll this week.
I was a little bit surprised. I really thought that Midland would slide into that number 2 spot just on the way polls seem to work and everything. But, I think a lot of people have such a high regard for what South Charleston's got going for it. They know that they looked at that score, that 55-15 from last year in the Super 6 and then 26-21 now, and realized that, okay, they're a lot closer to Capital than they were last year. And Capital's still pretty good, so I think that was the mindset in a lot of voters.
I thought, not necessarily surprised, but one of the things I thought that game would hinge on is, can South Charleston play defense against this Capital offense? I thought they set the tone early with that. They were in the Capital backfield. They were putting hits on junior running back Silas Nazario. He fumbled in the third quarter. I believe C.J. Perkins stripped the ball from him, went 70-some yards the other way for a touchdown. And South Charleston wasn't committing those just drive-killing, momentum-killing errors and turnovers like they did in Wheeling last year. Remember, South Charleston went, and I think they scored first in that game. They went up on Capital, and then it was just like, here comes the boat race. Capital and waves and waves and waves, and that didn't happen on Friday.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I don't know if we talked about it on here last week or was just newsroom conversation, but the idea that if South Charleston kept it close early, it would stay close, and that's what played out. The Nazario fumble and C.J. Perkins had a heck of a game. That reminded a lot of people in the press box of when Ray Coleman stripped the fumble from Hurricane in 2010 and raced the length of the field to give South Charleston a win there. South Charleston is just, they're right there. And I think what we also saw in Capital's early struggles, particularly to run the football, was, they're missing Burks from the line from last year, and they're still in the process of really rebuilding that line. And Silas Nazario, as good of a player as he is, and I think he is a game breaker, but he's not Kayshawn Haley. He's big. He's not going to break that kind of run all the time.
And you saw when Capital was able to get the ball moving on the ground, it was a lot of Tyree Pratt.
Yeah.
Not on design runs necessarily. Drop back to pass, take your reads, and then zoom around the end. Moving on, we mentioned Cabell Midland, number 3 in Class AAA in the Gazette Mail football poll, coming to visit Capital this week. Number 4, Wheeling Park. Bit of an odd situation with their game last week against Class AA number 1 Bridgeport, a team Ryan has seen play already this year. I believe the game was 0-0. The game had started, and I believe how much time was left in the first quarter?
6 seconds.
Yeah, not a lot of time left in the first quarter, and there was a lightning delay. Well, the lightning kept hitting. They ended up not being able to get the game in initially. The two schools had decided, we'll just call it a no contest. They'll have 9 games instead of 10. Well, SSAC comes in, and they deferred to the National Federation of High School rules. If the game started and it wasn't anybody's fault for why it had to stop, it was an act of the weather, then it's got to be ruled a tie if it was a tie at the time it ended. Game was 0-0. It was ruled a tie. That's going to have a lot of implications down the road as far as playoff seeding might go. Where do you think this goes for Wheeling Park? Because that's a team people kind of circled at the beginning of the year as like, well, if someone's going to break into that top group with the Capital, South Charleston's, Martinsburg's, Cabell Midlands, this might be the year for Wheeling Park. Now they're going to have a tie on that record. That's going to drop them down a couple spots come November.
Yeah, they're the only team that's beaten Bridgeport in the last 2 years, and I think whether Bridgeport pulled out a win that night on Friday or not, look, if Wheeling Park was going to get that win, they would have got the 9 points Bridgeport gives them toward the SSAC rating formula, plus whatever wins Bridgeport accrues throughout the course of the year. They'd get bonus points for that. As it is, Wheeling Park now gets half of 12 is, or half of 9 is 4.5. They get 4.5 points for the tie, and in a AAA field that looks like, yeah, Wheeling Park is on everybody's radar as one of those top 4 teams, top 5 teams this year. That could make the difference between going on the road in the second round or being at home, and even further. I mean, if they ended up in the top 2, I think it might hurt Wheeling Park more than it does Bridgeport in the long run. I don't see anybody on Bridgeport's schedule that is going to beat them. Ryan, has seen them firsthand. They've got a game against Lewis County this week, and then they play their arch rival Robert C. Byrd in 2 weeks, which is going to be a big game either way because Byrd's a really good team. But thoughts on Bridgeport?
Yeah, I've also seen Byrd too.
That's right. Yeah.
Bridgeport getting those guys back in the backfield. We all know about Bonamico, Tonkery, and Spurlock there, and they were every bit as advertised in a season opener, against a AAA school on the road.
Yeah, they put one on Buchanan Upshur.
Yeah, I think it was 50-13, I think was what the final of that game was. They could have picked a number, really, in that game.
That's kind of surprising from Bridgeport, too. I mean, you think of, the stick eye and that strong running game, but they're not really a team that is dropping 50 on people every week. So I was a little surprised to see that score. Not necessarily that they won big, but 50, that's a lot of points for Bridgeport.
Yeah, they were they pulled starters out pretty early in that game. And Dylan Tonkery is one of those kids that you don't even have to watch play. You watch him step out on the field, and it's going to be a long day for the opposition. So.
Yeah, I had that exact thought during the Class AA title game last year in that torrential downpour in Wheeling. He just. Frankfurt kids are probably still having nightmares about Dylan Tonkery from that game.
Yeah.
We'll jump back up to AAA. We left off with number 4 Wheeling Park. Number 5 Point Pleasant. Big game for them this week. They are at Wayne, one of the traditional powers in Class AA. They won a bunch of state titles, had a bunch of all-state type guys. Wayne's number 9 in Class AA right now this week after a season opening loss against county rival Tulsa. I'm picking Point Pleasant in this game. I think Wayne might be a little bit down this year, as evident by that loss to Tulsa, but this is still a proud program.
Oh, yeah.
Tommy Harmon's one of the better coaches in the state. If someone's going to get his team ready for a challenge like Point Pleasant presents, I would think that Tommy Harmon's one of those guys. Is this a toss-up game, or if Wayne wins, would you be surprised at all, or is this pretty much Point Pleasant should roll in this one? I have a hard time gauging this one.
I don't know about roll, but I would find it surprising if Point Pleasant loses this week. Not only do they have Cody Mitchell back, but they have so much depth and size up front that they're really difficult to challenge, especially from a AA team. And no knock on Wayne. I'm not going out to insult anybody or anything like that. But numbers are numbers. And Point Pleasant, if anybody looks in the playoff programs for the last couple of years and they have like the team pictures of all 16 teams making it, Point Pleasant has had 80 plus kids on their team. They have so many kids come out for that program anymore that they just have too much depth, I think, for most AA's, in fact. And I'm going down to that game. It's the Gazette Mail Poll game of the week, the statewide game of the week.
Explain a little bit about that, because that's something new we've been doing this year. We had Magnolia Williamstown last week.
The thing is, what we're doing with this is taking a look at the Gazette Mail Poll every week and finding a matchup outside the Kanawha Valley. I got a lot of flack last week because Capital South Charleston wasn't the game of the week. Well, they're here, okay? We want to look across the state, and last week we had Magnolia Williamstown, which were tied for the number 1 spot in Single A, and that turned out, as Ryan will talk here in a minute about, I'm sure, to be a whale of a game. I don't think we missed the mark there at all. This week we're going to Wayne to cover Point Pleasant, going down there. The last time I saw that game between the two, well, actually, it was the 2011 title game when Wayne ran away from them. But in the regular season that year, Wayne played up at Point Pleasant, and it was honestly one of the best games I've ever covered. I mean, these two will go at it regardless of Wayne being AA, and I think I agree with you that they are rebuilding a little bit this year.
Moving on from that, at number 6 in the poll this week was Huntington. They host Parkersburg. Huntington's, we talked some last week about, Huntington is what Huntington is. They're going to play great defense, but the offense might leave a little bit to be desired if you're looking for a lot of points. Well, they came out and just smacked Spring Valley around last week. Parkersburg, on the opposite side of that, just got drubbed by GW 2 weeks ago. I think this one's probably Huntington in a walk, especially at home. Number 7, Morgantown. Another team, I'm not quite sure what Morgantown has this year. They're number 7 in the poll. They're 2-0. They're at Parkersburg South this week. I think that'll be a big test for them. If you listen to the last week's podcast or watch last week's podcast, I'm real high on Parkersburg South this week. At number 8, Jefferson out from the Eastern Panhandle, 1-0. They're at Musselman, who this might not be Musselman's year. We mentioned number 9, Parkersburg South. They are hosting Morgantown. And number 10, Martinsburg. That is weird to say.
Yeah.
Martinsburg's 0-2 and has lost 3 games in a row for the first time since the Great Depression. I think. Making a long trip for them at Princeton. So that's, again, we've mentioned this in the past on and off the podcast. There's been a lot of schedule shuffling in AAA with Princeton and the MSAC teams, and Princeton having the other side of that. We talked about teams having to fill holes in their schedule because of Princeton. Princeton had to fill their whole schedule, and their reward was a trip to town from Martinsburg. Class AA, we mentioned Bridgeport. They're at Lewis County this week. Number 2, Bluefield at Woodrow Wilson. And Ryan, we'll go to you on this one. Number 3, Fairmont Senior. You've seen the Polar Bears play. It's a team I covered for several years. J.L. Abbott, another one of those guys like Tommy Harmon. He is a good coach. He will get kids ready. The Polar Bears are at Preston, who had to finish their game. Was it Lewis County that they played? That they had their game got delayed and they had to finish it on Monday. I believe it was Lewis County. Preston ended up winning that game. Number 3 for the Polar Bears, maybe I'm just reserving judgment. That seems like it might be a little bit high. Ryan, you've seen them play in person. You think that's about where they should be?
Defensively, they're really good. And their front 7 is, they stymied RCB in the first half of that game. No first downs, minus 22 rushing yards in the first half of that game. They're led by a sophomore defensive end who we really need to keep an eye on. His name's Dante Harris. He was in the backfield the whole game that game. But, offensively, of course it's the first game of the year, so you don't want to draw too much judgment from that. They have some weapons. Nick Davison on the outside is a great wide receiver. But for now, they're 2-0, and they started the year pretty high in the poll, so it's kind of hard to knock them down winning 2 games. So it seems about right for right now, yeah.
Number 4 in AA this week, 2-0, Kaiser. Kaiser might be bouncing back a little bit this year. They had a lot of eggs in that basket 2 years ago when they kind of it didn't work out for them. 2-3 years ago, we've been over this. Once you get in the Super 6, unless it was last year, they all tend to run together for us.
It was 2012.
There you go. They are 2-0, heading out of state at Fort Hill, Maryland. That's not too much of a trip for them, I do not believe. Yeah. At number 5, Tulsa, and I want to stop on Tulsa for a second. The Rebels are 2-0. They're at Fairland, Ohio this week. We had an article on WVHuddle.com earlier this week in the Gazette Mail. Rick Ryan, one of our great prep reporters, along with Ryan Pritt, he talked to Tulsa's coach, and I've got it here. I want to find some of the quotes here. He said, Rebels coach Mike Smith, we knew we're going to be pretty good, but it's like everything else in the southern part of the state. We get no respect. It's one of those deals. We thought we'd be pretty good, but not everybody knew about us. He's barking up the wrong tree. He's down the road from Wayne, who gets tons of respect, and they're in the same part of the state. Bluefield, one of the best programs, regardless of class in the state, is on the Virginia border, as southern as it gets. I don't buy the southern part of the state gets no respect thing. And Derek, you might be able to speak to this a little more than I could. You've handled statistics for the last few years. You've been on the All-State committee for the last few years. If it's not the sports writers or the coaches that aren't giving these guys respect, Tulsa wasn't very good. And that's the long and the short of it. I'm not saying that these kids are bad football players, but they weren't winning games. They weren't putting up ridiculous numbers in the past. Now, that's not to take away from what they've done on the field this year. They're I think the best story in the state right now. 2-0, look, with wins against Wayne and Mingo Central. I mean, those are 2 teams you could have penciled in for Wheeling as maybe the 2 teams that could take a shot at Bridgeport to unseat them in AA. Now it's looking like Tulsa could make a run here. And I don't want to diminish what they've done this year, but it could just kind of stuck with me playing that. Oh, we don't get any respect in this part of the state card. I don't buy it.
Yeah, the line that really bothered me, and I would like to address, is the line about All-State being garbage and political. Could you find that for me?
Here we go. They're just as good as they were last year, Smith said, but nobody was paying attention to them because we were 4-6. If Presley's not one of the, and he's talking about Luke Presley, one of the great running backs at Tulsa, if Presley's not one of the top 2-3 players in the state, it'd be a travesty to even print stuff like that. It's a joke. And here's the line you were looking for. The all-state teams are political and garbage. He ran for 1,400 yards as a junior and got honorable mention all-state. Give me a break. I'll just let you go
all right
on that.
Here's the thing. I chaired the All-State Football Selection Committee for 7 years, and I still serve on it. Here in front of me, I have all the ballots from Class AA coaches that were sent in last year. We got Mingo Central, we've got East Fairmont, we got Chapmanville, Frankfurt, Wayne.
Yeah, all of them,
yeah, you get the point, okay? Tulsa's not in here. So Tulsa didn't send a ballot. Most of these coaches who send in ballots send in stats for their team. So the committee was not given a ballot from him. They weren't given stats from him. And what I also have is the vote totals for Class AA last year, and every player in Class AA is listed as to how many votes he got from coaches, from writers, and at what position. Through this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-page, group of votes, not one player from Tulsa received a single vote. Not from writers, not from coaches. So I'm not really sure that writers who put the all-state teams together with the cooperation and input from coaches should really be pointed at as being fault for these teams being garbage, a joke, and political. A coach has to cooperate and help his own kids, or else they're not going to get recognition. And I think that response from him, or that statement from him, is laughable.
Yeah. Rebels, like we said, 2-0. Tied for 8th in the poll last week, jumped up to number 5 this week at Fairland, Ohio. Not too far of a trip, right there across the Ohio River from Huntington. The Dragons, they've got cool uniforms. You see them on some of the Friday night highlight shows sometimes. At number 6 in AA, Nicholas County, the Grizzlies are 2-0. They will host Wyoming East. Number 7, Mingo Central, coming off of that loss to Tulsa. And that just seemed, it was another one of the games. I think they had a couple of lightning delays during the Mingo and Tulsa game. And it seemed like it was back and forth kind of the whole way. Tulsa came back, and then Mingo had to come back. Mingo Central hosts Sissonville this week. Sissonville, if there is a team that is desperate for a win, it's got to be the Indians, and this is a tough one, don't you think? Both of you guys. I mean, you've seen Sissonville a lot in the past. We've all covered them. They kind of got to win this week. You start getting at 0-3, and you're looking at 4 losses might be too many to get into the AA playoffs.
Didn't they start 0-3 last year?
I think so, yeah.
And
Mingo got him in Sissonville last year, and I think that was the second or third game of the year too. So yeah, I think they did. And you mentioned a little bit how tough it's going to be to pick up a win. Playing Mingo is one thing. At Mingo is something else. You got the DJ blaring stuff in the end zone, and it's quite an atmosphere down there. So yeah, the Indians are definitely against it this week for sure.
Just to illustrate maybe the respect that Tulsa's being given that might not be recognized down in that part of Wayne County, Mingo Central was number 2 in the poll last week. That close loss to Tulsa knocked them all the way down to number 7. Now that might also speak to the depth of just quality teams at the top in Class AA, but not a whole lot of years in the past when Tulsa beat you that you drop 6 points in the poll. At number 8, Chapmanville, another Cardinal Conference team, 2-0. They host Scott. It's probably going to be Chapmanville. Scott's not looking like they've got a whole lot going on this year.
A lot of Southern teams in this top 10, aren't there? There's 6.
There's no respect down there, though.
4 teams in Tulsa's conference.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is a statewide poll. This isn't something we sit around and come up with ourselves. Sports writers from all over the state, the Southern, the Eastern, the Northern, the North Central, all over. How many people voted in it again? Is
10.
it 10 people poll? All right, that's what I thought. And at number 10, Robert C. Byrd, which you mentioned earlier, Ryan, and you've seen them play against Fairmont Senior. They were not rated last week. They're 1-1 now. They will host Frankfurt. The other teams receiving votes in AA, Grafton, Lincoln, Liberty, Raleigh, and Independence. And I skipped over the ones in AAA. Hurricane and George Washington were also receiving votes. Now in Class A, number 1, Magnolia. Ryan, we'll go to you on this. You saw them play last week in that game against Williamstown. Before we started recording here, you said something to the effect of like, man, Magnolia is really, really good. I'll just let you go. Tell us a little bit about Magnolia, what you saw, what you see coming from them.
Yeah, 21-14 in a game that came down to the fourth quarter. You think, it's a close game, and it was a close game, but a lot of that was due to penalties and turnovers from Magnolia in the first quarter. They turned it over twice. Where Williamstown hung in really with a great effort from quarterback Trenton Tallman, who ran for, I think, over 135 yards and both touchdowns. Magnolia really diverse offensively. 2 running backs that can get you in Anderson and Street. Quarterback Nick Preem made 2 huge plays, completions of 55 and 60 yards on rollout passes, not even set in the pocket. He also ran for a touchdown. Tight end Kyle Ritz with 2 touchdown catches. I mean,
sounds like they've got some weapons.
Yeah, Brooks Parsons on the outside, 2 catches for 115 yards. He was on both of those big plays, and one of them was on a 3rd and 15 in a tie game from their own 20-yard line. So, a lot of offense from Magnolia. Pretty solid defensively, held them under 250 total. That's going to be a team to reckon with the rest of the year, I think.
Yeah. And you've been pretty familiar with just the history of Magnolia football over the last 20, 25 years or so. And something you mentioned was in the past, a lot of Magnolia teams, they get into that situation and they start playing not to lose.
Yeah.
And obviously that wasn't, they might have done that week, but they ended up not losing. This seems like it's a little different Magnolia team this year?
I think it's a Magnolia team that is more experienced. I not just talking about age-wise, but these guys are all returning starters, and they've been through this grind. They didn't make the playoffs last year. They finished 4-6, I believe. Ritz was out all last year after making, I think, second-team All-State as a sophomore. This is a team that is really loaded with experience, and it's not like I'm trying to think of a Meadow Bridge or something like that, one of those small single-A schools. Magnolia is a drop down from AA just 3 years ago.
Yeah, kind of like Bridgeport and AA.
Exactly.
They're a team that every 4 years could end up being on the opposite side of the fence.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, probably myself included, just because I grew up there and I'm so used to Magnolia football, thought that they might be more dominant in single A when they stepped down. But I think might be that year that they just rip it up.
You mentioned a little bit last year they went 4-6. They lost to Williamstown by 4 points on a touchdown in the fourth quarter, and we all know Williamstown went on to win a state title. So obviously the talent's been there the last couple of years. Like you said, I think experience is really a big thing.
At number 2 this week in Class AA, Moorfield 2-0. And I'll lump a couple teams here together. Obviously, you got Magnolia at number 1, Moorfield at number 2, Williamstown coming off of that loss to Magnolia at number 3, and Wheeling Central at number 4. Just throw a year out there, and in any sort of order, these might be the top 4 teams in Class A. And we talked about Magnolia bouncing back this year off of a losing record last year, not making the playoffs. Wheeling Central last year, they were bad. That shocked me. Yeah, they were 3-7, 4-6, something like that. It was the first time they hadn't made the playoffs, I think, in 14 or 15 years. This kind of seems like I don't want to say the cream of the crop, but the traditional powers. It's one of those years in Class A. You're going to see the Wheeling Centrals, the Williamstowns, the Magnolias, the St. Marys. Man as long. When I was a kid, Man was a AAA school. Yeah. It's been they're single A now, but there's just been this crop of kids at Man. It seems the last 4 or 5 years that good athletes. They've won baseball state titles. They've been okay in basketball, football. They've been one of the consistent teams in Class A. Do you think there's anything to that? This might be a year for the traditional teams in Class A?
Whereas last year, it was kind of that opening. The whole theme last year was like, the non-traditional powers, this is your chance right here, And St. Mary's made it to the title game for the first time in school history, okay? They couldn't get over the hump, but they made it there. Tug Valley, which is number 5 this year, right now, it also had a good run to the semifinals. But I don't want to say the window is closed for those kind of programs, but I think what we are seeing is the return to power after maybe a year hiatus for the traditional powers in single A.
Yeah. And you mentioned Tug Valley there, 2-0 and at number 5. St. Mary's 2-0 at number 6. Man 2-0 at number 7. And Buffalo, let's stop on Buffalo for a little bit because we've joked around in the past that kind of like Spring Valley, Buffalo is one of those every other year teams.
Yeah.
One year you might be 0-10, the next year you might be 9-1 and go into the semifinals. Well, Buffalo seems like they've got a little something going as far as momentum carrying over for last year. I know they've got a lot of young talent, sophomore quarterback, solid running back. We touched a little bit on Buffalo last week, but 2-0, they host Double-A Poca. I know Poca's not the best team around, and Buffalo probably should win that game pretty handily, but I believe their coach was quoted in the Gazette-Mail and on WVHuddle.com this week as saying, it's a proximity rivalry. They're neighbors. Yeah. These kids have grown up knowing each other and playing against each other since they were small. And anytime you get that sort of situation, you see maybe not necessarily the level of the play going up, but the competitiveness is going to be there. Could you see Poca keeping this game close with Buffalo?
Yeah, I honestly can. I mean, I'm picking Buffalo to win it, but the fact that Poca kept Nicholas County from running away from it last week, and Nicholas is 6th in Double-A and beat Poca 28-13 shows me that Poca's not. They're not going to have a winning record, this year. But I think that they are taking steps in the right direction, and because of that proximity element to that rivalry, I think Poca could step up and sneak a win out of there. I'm going to go with Buffalo though.
No. Mr. Pritt?
Yeah, I agree completely. One thing to your point about the Nicholas game was actually at the Poca-Nicholas game last year in Nicholas County.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And, Poca held them to 35 points in that game, too. That not to take anything away from Poca, they probably have taken a step forward. But Nicholas kind of runs a really deliberate, slow, downhill, pounded kind of offense, and they're not, not one to probably break the 40-point barrier very often. So,
gotcha.
I'm going with the Bison this week as well.
Mm-hmm. Then at number 9, we've got East Hardy. They're off this week, and then they play host to Pocahontas County on September 18th. At number 10, Clay Battelle, 1-1 at Barnesville, Ohio. Others receiving votes in Class A in this order: Bishop Donahue, South Harrison, Fayetteville, Valley Wetzel, and Tyler Consolidated. Been a while since you've seen Valley Wetzel pop up in that list. I almost said Fayette just by habit. Yeah. And that does it for going through the Gazette-Mail poll for this week. What we wanted to do next was maybe get into a little bit to some of the individual players. We mentioned on the show last week that we like to reserve judgment as far as, who do we think will be in the running for certain awards. Well, we're 2 weeks in. We've got a chance between the three of us to see a pretty broad spectrum of a lot of these teams. Last week we debuted the WVHuddle.com Player of the Week on the show. It's already out on the website for week 2. It was Capital quarterback Tyree Pratt. I think, total yards over 200, had a hand in all 4 of Capital's touchdowns, 2 on the ground, 2 through the air, 2 great passes to Crunchy Bays. Not to take anything away from Crunchy, because he made great catches on both of those, but the passes were exactly where they needed to be. Pratt, of course, has verbally committed to WVU, and I believe the lineman you mentioned from Fairmont Senior, I saw something. He, just a sophomore, received an offer from WVU this week. So the Mountaineers keeping an eye on some of this in-state talent, so I figure we probably ought to as well. Just not narrowing it down, saying these kids are the only ones that can win the Kennedy Award, but just kind of spitballing names that you might be likely to see at the end of the year based on what we've seen so far. Tyree Pratt, Kentrey Greer, Dylan Tonkery. Any other names? I mean, those are the real obvious ones, I think.
Yeah.
What is his name? Luke Presley from Tulsa. If he keeps going like he's going, that could be a kid that could be in the mix as one of the, if not the Kennedy Award, for maybe the Running Back of the Year award. So maybe, like I said, just throw some names at me that we might not have mentioned. Kids you wouldn't be surprised to, not necessarily if they won it, but that are going to be in the conversation.
When Wheeling Park ever plays a whole game, Savion Johnson's going to show people that he's a Kennedy candidate, definitely. His dad won a Kennedy, and I believe that was 1991.
The Boogie?
Yeah, Daryl Boogie Johnson. Went on to play at Oklahoma State, and I think an injury cut his career short. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's what I remember. Mitchell at Point Pleasant, obviously, is going to be, I think right now,
he's a Marshall. He's verbally committed to Marshall, right? And he's had brothers that played there. He's, barring a huge breakout year and a bunch of other offers, he's probably going to end up playing green and white on Saturday.
Right. So I think right now, the three you mentioned, Pratt, Greer, and Tonkery, with Savion Johnson and Cody Mitchell, are our front five to begin with, as we're now just getting done with the first third of the season coming up in the next week and a half or so. I think those are the five that are in there. There's plenty of time for other people to join in that race and actually drop in, drop out, whatever. You mentioned Tyree Pratt, and I mentioned on Twitter, I thought that for a skill position player to have committed to WVU from in-state, I think Tyree Pratt's, the hype and everything surrounding Tyree Pratt has been so minimal, throughout his career. I mean, you have these players come up that commit to WVU or whatever in West Virginia, and they're heralded as, titans, larger-than-life heroes. Tyree Pratt has had Kayshawn Haley and everybody around him. Now, I think with this past week against South Charleston, he was close to 300 yards of total offense, 159 passing, and more than 100 rushing.
Like 103, 104,
yeah,
something like that.
And had handed all 4 touchdowns. I think he put himself right square in that Kennedy mix, and I think people are going to start looking at him more along the lines of the way they look at other kids from the state at skill positions going to WVU.
Yeah. And just from what I've heard and people chattering on sidelines and, the barbershop talk, I guess you could talk, it seems like a lot of people aren't really that excited for it because they don't think WVU's going to give him a chance. Yeah, he's got an offer, and yeah, he might go up there and be on the team, but this kid can play. We see it week in and week out. He is more than just being a good quarterback, which he absolutely is, and you didn't necessarily get to see a lot of his quarterback skills last year because he didn't have to. Capital was scoring 60 points a game, turning around and handing it off. That's what Tyree Pratt did for most of the game. But he's having to throw the ball more, having to make a lot more decisions, and he's passing those tests.
Something else about him real quick?
Yeah.
I could remember covering him when he was in the 9th grade and playing, and it was always sort of the thing where, well, this isn't his team yet. Like you kind of mentioned Haley, and there were other players along that way. I think his brother was a wideout on that first year.
Cliff.
He was a good player.
Cliff.
But now, this is his team this year, and I think you're right. I think what he did against South Charleston last week, even on Twitter and elsewhere, it really seems to be generating a lot of buzz for him.
One thing we should mention from that South Charleston game, wide receiver Fred Crozier, broken foot, out 6 to 8 weeks. Wow. That's a big blow for South Charleston. I know that Derek Pitts had he's gotten a lot of the hype with a lot of those offers that he's received, and he's a great player, but Crozier and Greer it's been them. I mean, when they were freshmen, you would get the box score in, and it would be, South Charleston scored 8 touchdowns. Well, 9 of them were Crozier 87 pass from Greer, and it seems like those two had just clicked for so long. And I wonder, obviously, if that game's not different, if Fred Crozier doesn't get hurt. I believe it was the second series of the game on a punt return. Yeah, South Charleston got the ball punted, Capital got the ball punted, and that's when Crozier got hurt. But going forward, I mean, I know South Charleston's got a lot of talent, a lot of talent, especially at the skill positions, but that sort of leadership. Obviously, Fred will still be around the team, but not being out on the field. I wonder if maybe that doesn't creep up on them at some point.
Absolutely. I think it goes back to what we were talking about with Magnolia. And you're saying Crozier's been a starter since his freshman year and has been Kentre Greer's favorite receiver his whole career. And Greer owns every passing record at South Charleston. So obviously, Crozier's got to be up there with the receiving records too. I mean, he's always played slot, so he's been that safety valve for Kentre his whole career, and not having his experience, on the field, I think is more damaging to South Charleston going forward than not having his athletic ability, because I think they have that in spades.
Getting back into the discussion about these Kennedy guys, Dylan Tonkery from Bridgeport. We talked a little bit earlier in the show about, he walks out on the field and you think, oh man, it's going to be a long day. Ryan, you're the only one of us that's seen him play this year. He's another one like Tyree Pratt. He has a WVU offer. He's got a little bit of family history with WVU. His older brother Wes was a linebacker, and it wasn't just like we were talking about lip service. Okay, he's a West Virginia kid. Bring him in. We'll give him a jersey and let him stand on the sideline. Wes played a lot at a very high level. Do you see Dylan being that same type of player that can get to that next level, and he's not just going to be standing on the sideline with the jersey on, he's going to be out on the field?
You know, I mean, you've seen him on the field physically. It's there. The kid is a beast. There's just no other way to say it. He's athletic. I mean, it wasn't just running over people. It was juking people. I mean, it was a pretty all-encompassing performance from a running back that you would want to see. And, yeah, I mean, the right work, the right development, there's no reason why he can't see the field in Morgantown, I don't think.
All right, we'll start to wrap things up there. Just a reminder, you can find all of our high school football coverage online at wvhuddle.com. We're all over social media. On Twitter, it's at wvhuddle. On Instagram, it's at wvhuddle. We'll do some periscopes every now and then, and you'll get to see all of this on your phone or your computer or wherever you happen to be at on Friday nights. Typically, I do something at halftime. Try to do something after the games, but sometimes it's just crazy. We didn't do one last week because South Charleston Capital was one of the few games that didn't get delayed by lightning, but getting out of there, it might as well have been.
Yeah.
Anything else you guys want to add before we wrap it up this week?
I think we're good, man.
Yeah.
Right. Good.
And I mentioned earlier, we're recording this on Wednesday. In the past, we've done it a little earlier in the week, but Wednesday is going to be our day this season going forward. So look for those, later in the week before the games get going on Friday. We'll be able to get you ready. Again, that's everything you can find for high school football that we do at wvhuddle.com. I'm on Twitter at Tom Bragg Sports. Derek is on Twitter at It's Really DT. You are at R Pritt. Easy enough. I knew it was something like that, but I didn't want to give you numbers or a dot or anything like that. All right. Once again, I'm Tom Bragg, Derek Taylor, Ryan Pritt. Thanks for watching the wvhuddle.com Prep Football Podcast. We'll see you next week.
Good.